Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thanks for having me. So, you know a little bit about what I do, but the way I kind of think about my work more is as some form of alchemy. And the question that I spend most of my days with is, how can we take all the stuff that happens in life, the conflict, the friction, everything that life throws our way, and transmute it into something of value, something that can actually help us become more resilient, that can enrich our relationships, and that can elevate all of us and help us thrive. And I've been thinking about this for a long time. It kind of goes back to my upbringing, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. One of my earliest childhood memories is at the age of 3, and I'm standing in the living room of my parents in Tel Aviv, Israel, where I was born and raised. And I look up at my father, who's wearing military uniform, and thinking that he must be the strongest man in the world, you know, at the age of 3. The year is 1982. My father was a first lieutenant in the artillery forces, Israel's artillery forces, and Israel was at war with Hezbollah guerrilla forces in Lebanon. And that was my first encounter with conflict, but living in the midst of the most intractable conflict in the world, it certainly wasn't the last. So in the 90s, for example, there was a time of very heated, a lot of violence between Palestinians and Israelis, and there were a lot of bombing attacks that swept through all of Israel's major cities, Tel Aviv included. And I remember taking public transit to school every day and sitting on the bus and feeling really, really scared that the bus might explode, which did happen on a fairly regular basis. It was a very scary time. And then when I was 18, I joined the military, and following the footsteps of my father, I too joined the artillery forces and was sent to Lebanon to effectively continue fighting the war that his generation had started. And we would get bombed on a regular basis. We'd have missile attacks that, you know, would go into our station. I lost a few of my, the members of my unit. And I left there in one piece and also with a fair degree of trauma lodged in my body. And I'll just give you one example. Shortly after my service, I went on vacation with some friends to this resort town in Israel, and we got this beautiful hotel room, and I went down on my bed to lay down for a little siesta. And apparently they were doing some construction work outside, because I wake up to this really, really loud noise, and I hold on to the bed, and in my mind, I was sent back to Lebanon. Like, I literally felt like I was being bombed in that moment. My brain couldn't really tell the difference. And so something happens to us when we experience trauma. It doesn't matter if it's physical or emotional, something happens. And our brain, as a survival mechanism, begins to identify other events that may or may not look like that trauma, and begins to identify them as that same trauma story, right? We begin to see it and attach the same story in different events as well. And so trauma really affects the way we see the world. It affects the way my people see the world as well. I like to think of it as a matrix, right? So the accumulation of events and histories that turn into beliefs that really shape the water that we swim in, through which we see the world and out of which we respond. Does anyone know the joke about Jewish holidays? What's a Jewish holiday? They try to kill us, we survived, let's eat, right? Not a very funny joke, but you get a sense of the narrative, right? There's this collective trauma that's being perpetuated, and from that lens, all of these events are not singular historical events, they're a continuum. that really shapes the water that we swim in. And then every event past that kind of rubs against that matrix and triggers it. And that trigger, by the way, is a biochemical response. It's a biochemical response that's actually 1,000,000 times stronger than your regulated brain, okay? And what happens there is your brain effectively shuts off, right? You're completely offline. So no cognitive thinking, analysis, decision making, all that is gone. Survival, right? It's the primal brain that really runs the show at that point. Okay, so what does the world look like when we're in that state? It looks really dangerous. It's really scary. And so we immediately revert back to this polarity, this binary thinking, right? Us versus them. It's a zero-sum game. Like you win or you lose. You're with me or against me. And we do it all the time. And that has consequences. And so the originator of compassionate listening, G. Knudsen Hoffman, used to say, perhaps every act of aggression stems from an unhealed wound. And that's what we do when we're in that state of trauma. We tend to react that way. We delegitimize another person's story, right? We can dehumanize, and that can very easily lead us to become the aggressor ourselves. As a group, it's very common, right? How often do we infer on a group something based on the actions of very few, based on very little information, as in the case of my people as well, right? And we do it as individuals too. So take a moment and think about a situation in your life, maybe with a colleague or a partner or a family member, where there's some friction, there's some tension, right? And just invoke that memory and notice what it does to your body. Okay, we'll pause on this for a moment. Right? And so what are you beginning to sense? Is there heat? Is your heart beating a little fast? Right? That's the alarm. That's that biochemical response that goes in your body. Right? What are the emotions associated with that? Anger, frustration. What are you telling yourself about that person? Right? The judgment, the blame. Now, I'm not even saying that whatever it is that you're telling yourself or saying about that person is right or wrong or good or bad, but just ask yourself, is that context really working for me? Right? What's the price that we pay when we do that collectively, as a group, when we other people in that way? And what's the price that we pay individually? What's the cost in terms of the stress that we put in our bodies, in terms of the strain on our relationships? How much more likely are we to resort to violence, to aggression, to not being able to see that on the other side there's actually a human being with a whole nother matrix, a whole nother experience? So how do we begin to shift? Right? How do we approach that space where I end and someone else begins with a little more grace? How do we train ourselves to become a little more comfortable with contradiction and with nuance, so we can actually become more permeable, let go of the rigidity of our identity and become a little more permeable and allow new information in? So I'd like you to focus for a moment your attention on the area of your heart, okay, your chest area. And if you want to put your hand there, you can. And if you're comfortable just sitting, that's great too. And just take a few breaths in and out through your heart. Just a little slower and a little deeper than normal. Good. Just nice, even breath. And as you do so, make a sincere attempt to experience some renewing feeling, maybe care or appreciation for something or someone in your life. And it could be as simple as your pet or a day on the beach, or someone you care deeply about. And just take a moment with that. And just take a couple more breaths. And gently bring yourself back. Good. Simple. What was it like? How do you feel? Soothed. I love soothed because what we basically did was we reminded our body that we're safe. Very quickly, just by interjecting with our breath or with some renewing emotions, we can regulate our system and remind ourselves there's no tiger in the room. I'm not in Lebanon anymore, right? We're safe. And that, by the way, is an incredibly regenerative state to be in, because effectively what happens is your body is able to take some of the resources invested in defense and contraction and reallocate it into your body's areas that need it the most. And so there's actually 1,400 physiological measurable benefits that occur when we tap into that state. Now what else happens? Congratulations, your brain is back online. Okay, so I want to tell you a story when I actually practiced this. So that was a few years ago, and my husband and I were just dating at the time, very, very new relationship. He's here, by the way. Hi, baby. And so we're driving down to Portland on the little trip, and that was during the primaries. So you probably remember that time, Sanders and Clinton, and who has better chances of defeating Trump and all of that. And so we're driving the car and we're having this lively conversation about who has better chances and who are you for and like what do you want to see and all that good stuff. And I think we're having a lively conversation because at some point he turns to me, and he's driving, by the way, he turns to me and he's like, okay, let's stop. I don't want to have this conversation anymore. I just want to stop. Like I don't want to talk anymore. In kind of like that abrasive voice. And I'm immediately taken aback. I'm like, oh my God, what just happened? Like, what happened? Why is he so upset? And, and at this point, you probably know that I live and breathe these kinds of conversations, and particularly, politics. And in my mind, I'm like, can I even be in a relationship with someone who can't hold his side of the conversation? And I get really heated and, really upset, and I'm about to say something. And then luckily, I remind myself of my own practices, and I pause, and I notice it, and I do exactly what I did with you, and I just regulate my system for a moment. And after a few short moments, I turned to him and I said, baby, I'm noticing a lot of heat. And can you tell me more? And he said, I'm just so frustrated with the political system and the way it is, and I have this debt that I feel like I can never pay off. And I feel sad, and I'm just so frustrated by everything that's happening around us. And in that moment, my heart just completely expanded, right? And I just look back at that moment still, and I think, wow, if I were to just go for it, all the information that would have been lost, the connection that would have been missed, the new information that was introduced that, that would not have become available. And so in compassionate listening, one of the guiding principles is everyone has a right for partial truth. And it's a truth that transcends beyond facts or judgment or blame. It's a truth of our essence. It's a truth of values and needs that are not being met. I'll just keep going. Yeah, you're fine. I'm doing just fine. We're past that point anyway. Yeah. Okay, so it's a truth of essence, right, of needs and values. I mean, listen to what he was actually saying in that moment, right? What are the values that are being reflected? Freedom, dignity, autonomy, trust, right? I mean, who can empathize with that? And so when we actually train ourselves to listen to that deeper level, there's an opportunity to really see things from another person's perspective, and also maybe an opportunity to find some common ground. And so to me, this is incredible, right? The fact that on one hand, we have this survivalist instinct to recoil and to defend and to protect. And then on the other hand, we have this amazing technology that allows us to empathize and connect. The heart produces an electromagnetic field, measurable electromagnetic field, that extends a few feet outside of our body. Just to compare, the brain produces an electromagnetic field as well. It extends an inch. The heart extends a few feet. It's significant. Okay, that's fact number one. Two, that electromagnetic field is affected by our emotions, right? So an electromagnetic field of frustration or anger looks very, very different than one of care and compassion. Three, that electromagnetic field, we know, can actually affect organisms within its sphere. DNA, other humans. That's science for you. Okay, so a really good question for all of us to ask ourselves is, what are we feeding the field today? Right? What are we actually putting out into the world? And so on the delegations, the compassionate listening delegations, we meet with people and hear their stories from the entire political spectrum, by the way, and we sometimes encounter people who actively work to change their own story so they can feed the field something that they actually want to see. And I want to tell you just one story of one of those incredible humans. His name is Ibrahim Issa, and he's a principal of a school called Hope Flowers. It's near Bethlehem. And like many Palestinian men, Ibrahim was arrested, tortured. His house was demolished several times by the Israeli military, and only for them to rescind their allegations against him, by the way. And Ibrahim channeled this trauma into creating a teacher program that equips the teachers in his school to deal with the kids' trauma so that they don't resort to violence and aggression. And that program, by the way, is now being taught in 130 schools across the West Bank. And with tears in his eyes, he tells us that every time he teaches that program, he's reminded of his own trauma. And he said, our trauma should help us continuously look for ways to connect and to find peaceful solutions so that we don't we don't get trapped in our own wounds, in our own sense of victimhood that results. And so to me, this is incredible. And we meet with people across the political spectrum who do that kind of work to bridge the gap, to change the story, to heal those polarities. And in my opinion, that is the most radical thing that we could each do in our lives, in our communities, workplaces, anywhere, right? And so I covered a lot already in terms of information and tools, but it boils down to something really, really simple, right? pause, notice what's going on with you, right? Notice what's alive, anchor, right? Remember your own strength, your own resiliency, and then listen. And listen for the deep layer, right? The essence, the values, the needs. That's all, really. And it also makes a cute little acronym, PAL. So you can just take that and put in your back pocket and run with it, right? So that's all, collectively and individually. Really, I mean, if you're able to do that, if you're able to show up, speak your truth, speak your values, listen for values, and remember that you have a choice in any given moment, right? Either to recoil or to expand, right? Either to defend or to connect. So let's try it for a moment, okay? And I want you to think back on that story that was, that we were talking about earlier. And as you think about it now, just connect for a moment with your own essence, right? Your own needs and your own values in that moment. Not necessarily what that other person did, but really, like, what's really important to you? Why that was triggering to begin with. Okay, so just spend a moment with that. And then, underneath your seat, you'll find a card. And go ahead and pick up the card. Don't look at it yet. And when I tell you to look at it, I want you to try to see the other person in that card. Don't look at it yet. Okay? Don't look at it yet. And so the question I want you to ask yourself is, where might the other person coming from? Right? What's their matrix? What are their values? What are their needs? Go ahead and take a look. And see if the card reveals anything about your situation from that other person's perspective. And just ask yourselves if you can hold both truths, both stories simultaneously. They say that if you were to take two heart cells from different hearts and put them in a petri dish, then over time, they'll find a third heartbeat and start beating together. So listen for that heartbeat. Thank you.